Hi everybody, and Happy New Year. Welcome to the Vikings wrap-ups of Tata Steel 2020. This is the first tournament of a new decade, a decade that will bring a lot of change to chess. We already have AlphaZero beating the best chess computers, and the artificial intelligence will just become better and better during this decade. It's already started to bring some changes to chess, and hopefully it's gonna be even better. This year's field is very interesting. We have many young players and still one player that's been in the world top for about 3 decades, Vishy Anand. To start with, we have Giri and Caruana that will play the candidates tournament this year, and I believe they will save their secrets until that tournament and not push too much in this one. So my expectation is to see many draws from these two guys, and I don't see any one of them winning the tournament. Magnus, who is the reigning world champion, he is always one of the favorites, and he is probably the favorite to win this year's tournament too. One of the main challengers is probably Wesley So, who won the Chess 960 World Championship, the first guy to beat Magnus in a heads-up match, and he's probably become more self-confident and is on the way back to find his best play, because he was really good a couple of years ago, and then it was pretty quiet around Wesley for the whole 2019. There are another couple of interesting players. For example, Yu from China, we have Vityugov from Russia, and Artemiev also from Russia. These three, they are pretty strong, but I can't see them winning the tournament this year. They will probably end up somewhere in the middle, or if somebody of them have a bad week or two, they might end up in the bottom. Dubov and Kovalyev will probably struggle, also Van Forest. Even if I can see that Van Forest won the first round, I think he will struggle when it comes to the mid and end of the tournament. These three guys will probably be on the other half, maybe even in the bottom. So who can then challenge Wesley So and Magnus Carlsen for the victory? I think my wild cards will probably be Duda, a Polish player that is on the way up. He's established himself in the top at least 20 in the world and is becoming better and better for each year. And then the other wild card would probably be Ferrugia. Ferrugia is also climbing, and he's still very young, more eager to win than afraid of losing, and this is very important when it comes to winning a tournament. You have to be confident, you have to take risks to be able to win games. And I think Duda and Ferrugia might surprise the others and win the tournament. Other players that probably will be in the middle are Xiong, a young and talented player from the US. I don't believe he will win this year, but he might do it in the future sometimes. And last but not least, we have Vishy Anand. He became Grandmaster the same year the second oldest player in the field was born, Vityugov. And he even became the world champion before some of the youngest players in the field even were born. So he's very experienced, and you should never underestimate Anand, but I don't believe he will win this year. He's about 50 years old, and I think he's more afraid of losing than eager of winning. And this might make him take some safe decisions in critical situations, or maybe just be happy with a draw in a slight advantage position. And then we have the challengers. In the challengers we have few new names that will be very interesting to follow in the future. We have Nihal, Kamer, Smirnov, and Abdusatorov. These four guys are very young, and it will be very interesting to see what they can perform in this tournament, but also the coming years. But this time, I don't think any one of them will be able to become the challenger for next year. I would expect the top 4 rated players. They are still pretty young and very strong, but also got some experience from other big tournaments. And those 4 I would expect to fight for the victory are probably Anton from Spain, Grandelius, our own Viking, that we will be focusing on most of the players in this year's Tata Steel. Then we have Rauf Mamedov, a very tactical player and dangerous player, and also Elyanov. Elyanov is one of the oldest in the field and very experienced. So we will choose a couple of games to focus on. This is just a wrap up, and we will choose the most interesting ones. We have to start with the Rain World Champion, who played Anish Giri. Giri, who might be the challenger this autumn for the World Championship title. So let's go to the game. Magnus tried something new this time, but it didn't really work out as he was wishing. He tried with the English opening, and I think he tried to play a Sicilian with the tempo more. Continuing a few moves, and Queen b3. This is a bit of an opening surprise. I don't believe that Giri was prepared for this. And the whole aim is probably just to get a better control of this square d5. Usually black want to break with d5, and in this position it's not possible because of it's just hanging. So Magnus probably played Queen b3 to get the control of d5 and get the control of the complete center after playing d4 a couple of moves later. So let's see what happened. Giri chose to play g6. They continued developing, and Magnus got the center. At the same time, b3 is probably not the optimal square for the white queen, but he at least accomplished what he wanted to get out of the opening, and it's the control of the center. Black went with the quick castle, and the question is if Magnus should push d5 already in this position, just to see where Anish will put his knight, because there are ideas with checking bishop to e2 and exchanging this knight, but then white can get a tempo with bishop f4 for example after an exchange here, and a quick castle, or just even castle already here. This is not a very bad move, probably. And there are other ways to just develop. But black can also play the knight to a5, which is probably what Magnus was afraid of, because then he might get problems with the black diagonal. He can get some problems with the center pawns. For example, in this position he can't just go back with the queen because c4 is hanging. And I think he tried to play it a bit slow and not to open up too many weaknesses in his position. So he continued with bishop to e2, Anish with d6, Magnus with the castle, and rook to e8. And it's not really sure how white should use the center and put more pressure on black here, because black got the only open diagonal and the pawns in the middle are starting to be somehow a little bit weak, and if you for example push d5, then he opens up some squares here on c5 and d5 for black, but also this diagonal for the bishop. So he got to be a little bit careful. Maybe d5 is the best option. Maybe he should play something like rook to e1, or also just going back with the queen to d1 to put more protection on the pawn and then continue developing. But after moving the queen, then he allows black to play d5, and then the white center pawns might end up being weak instead of strong. It's a position they have to play very precise to get something out of it, and Magnus chose to play h3. Maybe a bit too slow, but maybe also a good idea to remove the g4 square for black, for example being able to play bishop to e3. But Anish, he is a very safe player, and he already found a very good way to exchange some pieces to keep up the initiative and put pressure on the weak d4 pawn. So Magnus had to take, Anish took back, and now Magnus got some problems. He will be losing the d4 pawn. For example, in this position, if he would go protecting this pawn, which might have been one of his ideas from the start, but then knight g3 looks a little bit dangerous. If he takes the knight, the rook will take the bishop. Maybe black got some initiative and white got a weak pawn on d4. If he choose not taking the knight on g3 and just moving the rook, then he will be losing the bishop maybe. Or maybe even black can just stay with knight on g3 and focus on putting more pressure somewhere else, because white can never take it. This bishop is hanging. So it's a bit tricky, and I understand Magnus took the safe way out. He took the knight. Anish took back and he played bishop e3, protecting the pawn. And here are a couple of ways for Anish to take. He can either take with the knight or he can take with the bishop. Taking with the bishop might be the best option because then he will put pressure on this white square bishop after taking back with the knight. For example, knight takes, and now Magnus needs to do something with the bishop. And if he takes here, Anish can choose which one to take. It's probably best to take this one, because he's weak on the black squares around the king. And yeah, it's hard to tell, but maybe putting pressure on the rook, because the rook don't want to go out on the h file. It's probably gonna play c5, exchanging one rook. And we can see that the pawn on d6 will be a very weak pawn. So Magnus will probably capture it. We can continue with this position. For example, exchanging, developing the bishop, putting pressure on the pawn. And it seems like Magnus will win this pawn back, but Black will have a slight advantage in the endgame because these pawns will be on white squares while Anish himself will have a pawn on the black squares. And this is always a slight advantage when you only have the white square bishops left on the board. But still very hard to win, probably ending in a draw. But Magnus, after the bishop e3, we have Anish playing knight takes d4. Probably the most safe way of continuing. Magnus had to take and try to exchange everything into a very drawish endgame because he's actually a pawn down here and in trouble. From the start, he might have missed rook to h4 because it's a square you sometimes might miss for the rook. It's not that normal to have a rook on h4. The game continued with another couple of exchanges. Magnus took on b7, Anish took back, and in this position Anish chose to take on c4. And that's probably the best option, because he could maybe try to get the b file, but after taking this one he will have to take on c4 and then he's losing a tempo compared to taking immediately. And white might play b3 after moving the rook, just put pressure on c file. And it might even be that, okay, it's probably a draw, but maybe white got some pressure on the c file. Very hard to tell. Or simply just exchanging everything. Going to pick up this one. And this is ending up in a draw. So Anish took on c4 and Magnus took the c file immediately, putting pressure on c7. Anish took on c1. Here he could maybe have tried with rook to b8, gaining a tempo compared to the previous variation, but it's very hard to tell how this endgame will end. For example, now Magnus got the opportunity to grab two rooks. Taking here and taking there. And this rook is probably coming into the game. It seems to be pretty drawish, but you never know. The white rooks will enter, for example a5, this rook might enter, or maybe even start with a check. Putting the rook behind. But this seems like it's Anish fighting for some slight advantage, pushing the pawns and maybe even in this position centralize the queen. And then start pushing. So there was probably some opportunities for Anish to get a better endgame. The other option for Magnus would probably be to take this one then. After an exchange, maybe even taking here. And it seems like Anish will get the pawn up in the endgame. Still very hard to win, but there are some chances. Let's see how the game continued. Anish chose the most safe way. He simply just exchanged the rooks, played c5. After Magnus putting some pressure on d6, Anish chose to just go for the draw and exchange all the pawns. And few moves later, after rook takes c5 from Magnus, they agreed on a draw. I think neither one of the players really got any challenges. They were probably never even getting tired and saved a lot of energy for the coming rounds. So let's continue to some other games. We have two winners of in the Masters of round 1. It's Van Forest having a nice upset against you, and we have Ferrugia, the youngest player in the field, a big talent, beating Kovalyev with the white pieces. Let's present our partner Techie Design and continue with Van Forest U. Okay, Van Forest chose to play e4 as the first move. He wanted to create something, play maybe a little bit more sharp in round 1. And let's see what you chose. He went for the Sicilian. Van Forest chose to play c3 Sicilian, one of the more safe options and not going into the more sharp variations. Knight to a3. This is a little bit more odd option of the c3 Sicilian, and at least white got some initiative here. a little bit tricky opening where black have to watch out for some forks, and this is nothing that you missed. He went back with the queen. Van Forest took back the pawn, and it's a very equal position where Van Forest got a small edge on the queen side with 3 pawns against 2, while you got 4 against 3 on the king side. We have a slight advantage in the development for white, but still it's very equal, and let's see how the game developed. Question is if he should maybe take with the queen here, but if he takes with the queen, then white gets some tempos. And for example, going back to d7 is very bad because of bishop b5, and he's simply losing the queen. So where should the queen go? Yeah, this is a little bit tricky, and it feels like you is giving more initiative to Van Forest than necessary. So he took back with the pawn. White centralized the bishop, which is a little bit odd, because it's probably not threatening anything. Taking the knight on f6 will just give black the bishop pair, and he can take with the pawn. For example, if black takes the initiative with rook b8 and then castles and maybe play c5 and then choose the right diagonal for the white square bishop. So for example, if we continue like this, castling maybe here, can he sacrifice the pawn? Probably not. Maybe playing safe. It's very hard to evaluate this kind of position. Probably a slight edge for white right now. The question is if he can somehow put pressure here. Or maybe that's the wrong pawn. Maybe pushing e5 is even better. Because white can never take. If he takes, then rook e8 for example. And white can get some problems on the e-file. In this position he's probably, have to play f4 and then c5, and it's very hard to evaluate, but it's a tricky position. At the same time, bishop d4 seems like a move where black might have options with c5 or e5 in the right position. Maybe bishop to d3 or e2, something like this might have been better, or maybe even going to d3. Okay, let's continue with the game. Bishop to d4, and you played bishop to b7. It feels a little bit like he is giving the initiative to Van Forest. Even if it's a very equal position, bishop to b7 feels like a little bit wrong in this position. I would prefer something like rook b8, at least taking the b file and then castling. Okay, let's see what happened. Bishop to b7. Van Forest, he takes the initiative with knight to e5. Jumps over to c4. Now threatening taking on f6. For example, if black castles, this one will be hanging. He got to take back, and then the bishop and d6 is hanging. Maybe even taking with the queen. Otherwise, rook to d8 might be dangerous. So you continued by going back with the bishop, queen b3, and now white is taking the b file instead of the black rook. Now it's not possible even to play rook to b8 because of the a7 pawn hanging. So rook b8, white takes on a7, and white wins. So he played bishop to a6. Van Forest chose to go for a queen exchange because these pawns on a7 and c6, they are much weaker than white's pawns, and he will go into an endgame with the slight edge. So you had to exchange some pieces. Question is if he shouldn't play maybe a move like king e7 here, just to keep a control on f6. Then he can choose if he want to take with the king or with the pawn in the future. At the same time, he can play this rook to either d8 or b8. But okay, he played bishop b6, that's probably not that bad. Van Forest created even more weaknesses, so you got a7, c6 and h7 that are lone pawns that are pretty weak. We have king e2, rook to g8. Continuing few moves. The aim of Van Forest is just to exchange pieces, especially the rooks, and then starting to chase the pawns with the knight. And in this position, Van Forest chose to play knight to e3. It's because he got the majority on this side, and he got the majority on this side. So if just exchanging all pieces, not, for example, if you takes with the rook, he's probably just losing the game. Because it will be impossible for the black king to stop a h-pawn running and the a-pawn running. So somehow this should be winning for white. Should just be a technicality. But in this position, black don't have to exchange the rook, so he can take with the c-pawn. But then there are two weaknesses to chase for white. And it seems like we got a similar position in the game. After knight to e3, you chose to change. And going back. This might have been a mistake, because he should try to keep this active rook at least. So for example, after a check, king here, another check, white got to choose where to go. Maybe even down here. And then exchanging a rook, and having one active rook to both protect the 5th rank, protect a7 and chase some pawns. And this should be a draw. Usually rook endgames are a draw. But yeah, sure, still white got some edge, but it's gonna be very difficult for him to win. You chose a less active option. He went back to d5. Van Forest, he just exchanged one rook and took the 4th rank. Activated his own rook. He started chasing the weaknesses. G4 is maybe not the best option, but it's tricky. It should probably be a draw somehow. But white got the edge on the queen side, and maybe he should try to take this one. After king takes, start running with the king. Maybe run with the AB pawn and have a very good location for the king. If e5 comes, then d5 is hanging. So somehow blocking the black king from going back and protecting the queen side, stopping the e-pawn, and at the same time being able to help out on the queen side. Let's see how the game continued. And king to g4. This might be a mistake. Because now white got the edge. Yeah, and he's simply just going down with his queenside pawns. White is much faster. So in this position there might have been a trick here. After e3, he got to push and create something. So white got to take, he pushed this one, and this rook on a6, it's a little bit offside. And if he would go back, for example, then black is the one having the initiative. The question is if he's able to use it somehow, maybe even coming with the king. And this might even be an edge for black, because now this rook is very passive, the pawns are far behind. The other option for white was probably going back with the king. But then, if black plays rook to f8, there is a threat, like, for example, king to g5, then simply queening. And this feels like it's still a game. Maybe it works out to sacrifice the rook. Okay, he's going over here maybe. And then queening. So going back with the king. Yeah, I'm not really sure. This is tricky, you have to sit and calculate a lot here. But it's still... The game is alive and black got some options. Maybe going here. But then white is gaining a tempo. Yeah, that was not the right way. Yeah, this is still a game. But black chose to play king g4 and Van Forest took the opportunity and won the game. The white pawns are simply much faster. Still a bit tricky, but queen is a queen. And this should just be a technicality. Fun Forest found the right way forward. And a few more moves. And there we go. The rook can't do much. If he goes back with the rook, there will be a lot of checks and the queen will just pick it up. For example, like this. Going up, we have this check. Continuing down, we'll have a check on g2. And it's game over. And if he would go down with the rook, he will just end up being checkmate. So a tough start for you. Hopefully he will come back tomorrow with the white pieces. And the second winner was Ferrugia against Kovalyev. Pretty nice win, but it was a huge mistake of Kovalyev in the opening. He simply overlooked a pawn, went wrong with a move. He should have went with the knight instead of the pawn he moved and lost the game. So let's continue with the challengers, where we have our own Grandelius fighting for the victory, and hopefully he's gonna be the challenger for next year, 2021. In the first round he played Nihal, a very talented young player from India, one of the future big names probably, and it ended with a draw. Let's start with that game and then we'll continue with one of the victories. Okay, we're back, and Nihal chose to play knight f3 in the first move. Usually a slow way of playing and inviting black to choose what he wanna play. So Grandelius started with c5. And then Nihal went for the Sicilian. Usually knight f6 is not played that much, I think. After, for example, knight to c6, we have moves like bishop b5 and knight f6, then sometimes you can even play a move like e5. Nils chose knight to f6, Nihal played a little bit strange bishop e2, maybe knight to c3 was the way forward. But bishop to e2 is a more slow way of playing, but it's not wrong. Let's continue a few more moves and see what happened. It feels like Nils got a decent opening. The white pieces feels a little bit strange, especially the queen on e3. Usually you want to put the bishop on e3 instead. But it's not impossible playing like this too. He maybe want to push e5 in some position, putting the rooks on c and d file, the bishop on b2 instead. Queen to e3 might be played to enable c5 in some positions, also not only e5, and also protect e4. Nils is putting pressure on the black diagonal for his bishop. It feels like black got a little bit better development and a slight edge here, but it's still tricky and it's hard to find the way forward, not getting a weak pawn on d6. So the optimal option for Nils would be, for example, if white takes and black can take with the knight on d6. Then he got a very strong black square bishop. The white square bishop is also strong, and this knight on d6 got a safe square with a lot of opportunities, going both back to e4, having the f5 square. So here it's more comfortable playing black. But Nihal, he chose to play queen to a3, putting more pressure on d6 instead. Nils moved from the file of the rook, and the question is if he shouldn't try to take on e5 somehow. Not sure if this is possible. After bishop to e3 taking this one. e7 is hanging and then maybe just rook to e8. The queen got to go back, let's say a3. And now it feels like black got a nice edge. Maybe I'm not sure, maybe playing f5 immediately, maybe saving it for later. Even just moving the queen up to c6 for example, activating the other rook, putting some pressure on the white diagonal. There's a lot of options. But after bishop to e3, taking on e5 might have been the best option forward. Just to avoid the pressure on d6. After rook to d8, Nihal gave him a new option, but now it would be losing a tempo. So for example, taking here, queen takes e7, going back, and then, I'm not sure, maybe even queen to d7. It's a tricky position, but it feels like black got a slight edge. Chose queen to e6. Now it's at least threatening taking on e5. but at the same time it feels like a silly square for the queen. And now it's white getting a dangerous c-pawn. So it feels like the last couple of moves were probably not the best for black, and white got the initiative, a dangerous c-pawn. Yeah, this is very complicated game. Very open game. Let's go back a few moves here. Question is if knight c3 was the best option. He should maybe try to go back to e6 and put some pressure on the pawn. There are a lot of options. Nils at least managed to grab a pawn on a2. Yeah, and this seems like it's completely wrong. He had the option taking the pawn on e5 and getting a better control of the center in the mid game, but the development is not that nice for Grandelius, and it seems like he was a little bit lucky saving this game to a draw. I'm not sure if Nihal had to change. Okay, the rook is stuck, because he don't have any squares for his own rook here. He should maybe have went to c7. Tried to exchange one. Then the question is which one is quicker, this one or this one. But Nils got the right positioning on his rook, so he's covering the last rank and at the same time being behind the a5 pawn, so it's not that clear. Taking the bishop might have been the best move, and they simply exchanged most of the pieces. Nihal got the pawn up in the endgame, and this should be a draw. So Nihal was regrouping his pieces, and Grandelius was activating his rook. Nihal wanted to save the knight. If he could get, for example, the knight against the bishop and 3 against 2, but it's still not enough. It should be a draw all the time. So Nils, he simply went and took Nihal's knight. So now there are no proper tricks for white, or it's not that easy to build up anything. It's easier to protect with the knight than with the bishop. And this should just be a technicality. Nils is having a good fortress on the white squares, and when Nihal pushed the pawn, he will just exchange it. This game was actually plenty of moves. Soon, in this position, he is simply just giving away the knight. He could maybe have played a move like, say for example, knight back, threatening the pawn, and then coming with the king, but I guess he felt very comfortable that if he can somehow force the rook bishop against rook, he will be holding the draw for sure. So after king f6, there's not much to do for white than take the knight. And we got the rook bishop against rook. This is probably something that Grandelius has been looking at before the tournament, just refreshing. And it's a theoretical draw. So they were chasing each other for 50 moves until they agreed on the draw. Let's see a few of them. And what do you think? I think it's enough. Ah, there we go. There was the rook exchange and the draw was agreed. So then let's move on to one of the victories in the challengers, and we're gonna go to the game against between Lamy and Smirnov, because Lamy is one of the older players in the group. He's more experienced, while Smirnov is one of the young, hungry guys, and it showed that experience pays off, and we will see a very nice exchange sacrifice of Lamy, and very nice positional game that he won. So, we're back in a few seconds. Lamy chose the positional way forward, d4. He didn't want to play any tactical sharp variations against the young Smirnov. So Smirnov continued with d5, and it became a Slav out of this. Lamy playing the most safe option e3 already in move 4. And queen b3, this is inviting early endgame, and he can positionally have a slight advantage and hope for squeezing something out of the game. White got some advantage in the center and the A file to play against, while Black got a couple of squares for his knights, and he can maybe sometimes play against the weak double pawn on the B file. But it's very hard for Black to create something. It's usually a long-term game where White is slowly trying to find a way forward to break through Black's defense. And if White overpush, then Black can take the opportunity and create something. But let's see what happened. Knight to a6. There might be an idea to go to b4, or maybe via c7 to b5. But it's a little bit odd to play the knight to a6. Usually it's going via d7 to either b6 or f6. We can see that Lamy is taking away the b4 square, positioning the king in the center to be closer to the queen side. For example, if the black square bishops would be exchanged and Black plays a6 in some position, then he can enter through the black squares over here. But it's usually a slow play and it's long term. So he's gonna see if Smirnov will give him some chances and create some positional disadvantages. So bishop e7, and then Lamy chose to play the knight to c4. And after c5, Smirnov is inviting Lamy to sacrifice the exchange and gain a pawn. At the same time, get a really strong c-pawn and good coordination with the pieces. And this is what he took. So for example, if White would just exchange on c5, this will give a nice position for Black. He will have no proper weaknesses at all, and slowly, maybe even after a6, try to play against the double pawn on the b file. But Lamy took the chance, he sacrificed the exchange, got a really nice pawn on the c file and a slight edge. The coordination of the white pieces is amazing. Black got still a lot of weaknesses on the A file, and white is simply just having a lot of squares for the knight. We can also see that after pushing e5 here, for example, if black takes, we will just take back with this knight and create even more weaknesses. Weak pawn on e6, for example, going back, this one is hanging. Now white already got 2 pawns, e6 will be falling soon, and yeah, positionally it's a really nice play by Lamy. Smirnov continued with bishop back to d8, just to keep both diagonals for the bishop. Maybe take away the square on a5 for the knight in some positions. but instead he jumps into d6, secures a pawn on e5 to be able to have a really strong knight on d6, and every time black takes the knight he will take with the e-pawn and create two pass pawns. At the same time the king is close. This is why king e2 was much better than castling before, otherwise if he would castle the king would be over here. So he got two tempos in some endgame positions, and is a bit closer than the black king. If there will be a run over to the queen side. H5, not really sure what the point was. Maybe a move of frustration, he wanted to create something on the king side, but it's not that easy for black to go forward. We have some really nice pawns here for white, a strong knight on d6. He simply got coordination everywhere. Now the question is if he should start by playing the knight via e1 to c2 d4, just to put pressure on the rook on c6, some pressure on the pawn on e6, or maybe even starting moving his king, because what white want to achieve is a king on c4, having a control here and protect everything, being much closer if it's needed to push with the king, and move this knight over to d4. So simply activate the king and knight. These two pieces are the pieces he can improve. It's very hard for black to achieve something, and this is what Lamy is gonna do. He's slowly improving the pieces. We can see the knight going back. Now if he can go via f3, in some positions if black start running with the king, for example over here, goes to d7, then he can maybe sometimes go and pick up the pawn on g6. Maybe not immediately because he don't wanna lose the queen side, because g6 is not that important. Uh, but also this square is taken by the bishop, so this would be devastating for white. So king c7 and open up the square on d4 for the knight. So let's see what happened. A check. He took that one and took on a7. Maybe not necessary. After the check he could maybe even also just move the king. But a pawn is always a pawn, because now the square on d4 is not free for the knight. So he should probably take on b5 sometimes, and putting the king on c4 will not allow taking on b5 without a check. So taking is probably the best option, and taking on a7. White got a very active rook on the 7th rank. The knight is slowly finding the way up to d4, and black simply don't have any counterplay at all. Wow, he's even sacrificing the second exchange. Look at this positional move. Rook to d6, and if he takes it, he allows two pass pawns and the square on e5 for the white king to enter. At the same time, there are no squares. Black can't enter anywhere. Even if he goes in and threats b2, just bishop to c3, and there are no squares for this rook. Taking, yeah, and the king will enter, and then maybe the knight will follow. So white can choose how we want to win this. Smirnov, he don't have so many choices here. He got to take the rook. So he took it. Playing the king to f7, that is just too passive. Then the knight is coming. He got to take it eventually. And these two pawns will just be running. So he took, e takes d6, and the knight is going to pick up b5. Can't he protect the pawn? He should probably have protected the pawn. I would expect white to play the king first, because, for example, playing like this, if black want to enter, just put the bishop on c3. There are no squares for black to enter here. And activate the king, come with the knight, and then allow rook to a1. And it's hard for black, maybe something like h4 just to loosen up a little bit over here, but he can just take it. Try to create something and the king comes. Then we have knight d4 and c6, and it should just be great for white. Maybe putting the rook on a6 and sacrificing the exchange back if he plays this. Might be an option. Looking pretty drawish, but Lamy would never play c6, he would just take on b5. Go back with the knight, play b5, c6, and just start running with the pawns. So in this position, after knight to d4, he should probably have played rook to b8, just to cover this one. And then he can try to enter with rook a1, loosen up with h4. There might be some slight chances still. But after rook to a2, allowing bishop c3, and then playing rook to a1, this is just losing another tempo. White can go and pick up b5. Now he also got the c4 square for the king, not only entering via the black squares, he can also place the king on c4 and start running with the queenside pawns. So rook to the h file, he went to pick up the g pawn. Lamy simply just gave away the g pawn and went with the queenside pawns. A beautiful game, beautiful positional play, and after knight takes e6, there are no chances left. This pawn is queening, and white is winning. So probably the last chance was to try to save the b5 pawn in this position after knight to d4. But after that, Lamy played a very nice game and won with his strong queenside pawns. That was the highlights of the first round, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for today, good night, and see you tomorrow.